The sky above the alien city was red with smoke, and the air trembled with the sound of explosions. Fire stretched across tall, crystal towers that once shined in silver light. Now those same towers cracked and fell, leaving trails of sparks in the night. The alien world's capital had been proud, beautiful, and filled with music, but in this hour it was only chaos. Daniel ran through the heat and smoke with his heart pounding against his chest. He was a human soldier, not born to this planet, but sent here to fight in the name of peace. His boots pressed against cracked stone roads while broken shards of crystal glass crunched under his feet. Around him, alien civilians fled in panic, their voices echoing in fear. He did not know why he had turned left instead of right when the alarms rang. Something inside his chest had pulled him down this particular street, a voice whispering that someone needed him here. Through the orange wall of fire, Daniel saw her. She stood on the balcony of a half-broken palace building, dressed in silks that clung to her body and shimmered faintly despite the soot and ash. Her long hair was tangled, her face smeared with dust, but her posture carried dignity. Even in danger, she looked like someone important, maybe royalty. Behind her, flames devoured the curtains and smoke filled the windows. Without thinking, Daniel rushed toward the collapsing building. A beam fell across the doorway, blocking the stairs, but he climbed over it, ignoring the sharp pain in his arm. The heat pressed against him like a wall. His lungs burned with every breath, yet he did not stop. The girl coughed and stumbled as she tried to escape the balcony. She nearly collapsed when the railing broke, sending shards of crystal tumbling into the street below. Daniel reached her, just in time, grabbing her hand and pulling her back from the fall. "You'll be all right," he said, though his own voice was hoarse. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, a human covered in ash and dirt, sweat dripping down his forehead, still holding her as if she was a treasure. She tried to speak, but the smoke stole her words. Daniel wrapped his arms around her and lifted her against his chest. She was light, weaker than he had expected, and her head leaned against his shoulder. For a moment her eyes closed, and he feared she had passed out. The palace cracked above them. The balcony groaned as stone gave way. Without hesitation, Daniel carried her down the half-broken staircase. Every step felt longer than the last. The roof split with a crash, sending sparks raining down on his back. He shielded her body with his own and pushed forward. At last, they broke out of the fire and into the open street. The guards standing outside stared in shock. They had been preparing to retreat, believing no one had survived inside. Now they saw Daniel, a human, stepping out of the smoke with the girl in his arms. The scene looked almost unreal. The fire behind him, the girl dressed like a royal, and his determined steps through the ash. Civilians gasped. Some dropped to their knees. "He saved her," voices whispered. "The human saved royalty." Daniel had no time to think about their words. His arms ached from holding her, his throat dry from the smoke, but he kept walking until he found a safe corner of the street. Carefully, he laid her down on a piece of cloth. Her chest rose and fell weakly, but she was alive. Relief spread across his face. For a moment, silence filled the air. The fire still burned behind them, yet here in the shadows of broken walls, it felt like the world had slowed. Daniel stared at her features. Despite the soot and ash, she carried a certain grace. The silks, though torn, still hinted at wealth. Her long hair framed her face, and her eyes, when they opened again, held depth, like someone who had seen too much. "You're safe now," Daniel whispered. The girl coughed softly, and her lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. She tried to speak, but only managed a few broken words. Daniel leaned closer, trying to catch them, but her voice was too weak. He gave her water from his canteen, and she drank in small sips. Above them, the battle still raged. Shouts echoed, and more towers collapsed in the distance. Daniel knew they could not stay here long, but for now, he allowed himself a single breath of relief. The thought formed in his mind he had saved someone important. Maybe a princess, maybe a noble, but surely someone who mattered. That belief gave him strength. If he could protect her, maybe this mission had meaning beyond war. The girl's hand clutched his wrist suddenly. Her eyes opened fully now, filled, with fear but also something deeper. Her lips moved again, and this time her voice broke through, weak but clear enough for him to hear. They used me as bait. Her words struck Daniel harder than any explosion. His breath froze in his chest. The pride that had lifted him moments ago twisted into confusion. Before he could question her, another blast rocked the street. Shouts drew closer. The enemy was still hunting. The truth of her words would have to wait, but those words stayed sharp in his mind. Bait. Not a princess, not royalty, something else entirely. And yet, even with doubt forming, Daniel knew one thing clearly. He had carried her out of the flames, and now her fate was bound to his. The fire behind them raged on, but the greater fire was the one he now felt inside, a mix of duty, confusion, and the strange bond that had already begun between the human soldier and the mysterious alien girl. The night stretched on, heavy with smoke and falling ash. Daniel carried the alien girl through the ruins, searching for a safer place. Every corner of the city felt dangerous, every street filled with broken walls and burning debris. Still, he did not stop. He had carried her out of the flames once. He would not abandon her now. They finally reached a ruined courtyard, hidden by collapsed stone arches. The fires were distant here, and the air, though thick with dust, was easier to breathe. Daniel gently lowered her onto a flat stone surface and crouched beside her. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, but her eyes opened as soon as he set her down. She studied him silently for a long moment. In her gaze was both gratitude and fear. Daniel offered her more water from his canteen. She took small sips, her hands trembling. For a while neither spoke, the silence broken only by the distant cries of battle. Then her voice, weak but steady, cut through the stillness. "You should not have saved me." The word startled Daniel. He leaned closer, frowning. "What do you mean? You were trapped. I couldn't leave you." Her lips trembled and she shook her head. "They wanted this. They wanted you to come for me. I was never royalty. I was never meant to be rescued. I was the bait they dangled." Daniel's chest tightened. The memory of her words in the burning street echoed now with greater weight. Bait. He had thought it a mistake, the fever of someone half-conscious. But hearing her say it again, clear and deliberate, struck deep. "Why would they do that?" Daniel asked carefully, her eyes lowered. "Because they know what humans are. They know you cannot ignore someone in danger. They believe your compassion is a weakness. They thought you would come running and die in the fire." Daniel sat back, his jaw tense. He remembered the way the balcony had cracked, the staircase collapsing behind them, the way the guards outside had looked so surprised to see him alive. Perhaps they hadn't expected him to survive at all. "And you?" he asked after a long pause. "Were you part of it?" Her head jerked up, her eyes widening. "No. I was taken. I was chosen because I was unimportant. A servant girl, nothing more. They dressed me in silks and told me to stand in the flames. If I burned, they would lose nothing. If I lived, it would only feed their trap." The bitterness in her voice was sharp, but Daniel believed her. He saw it in her eyes, the anger of someone used and discarded. He gave a slow nod. "Then I didn't save royalty. I saved someone they thought could be thrown away." Her gaze softened at his words, and for the first time a small smile touched her lips. "Yes, you saved someone they never thought was worth saving." The words carried a strange weight. Daniel felt a warmth stir in his chest, not pride, but something stronger, respect. She had been treated as nothing, but she spoke with quiet strength. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Lyra," she whispered. "Lyra," Daniel repeated, letting the name settle. It fit her, simple yet carrying grace. "I'm Daniel." For a brief moment, silence fell again, but this time it was not heavy. It was the silence of two strangers beginning to understand each other. Suddenly, footsteps echoed through the streets. Daniel's hand went to his weapon instantly. He moved in front of Lyra, shielding her with his body. Shadows appeared at the edge of the courtyard. Enemy soldiers, Tall figures with armor reflecting the red firelight marched with deliberate steps. "They're looking for you," Lyra whispered, her voice urgent. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Then we move." He lifted her again, ignoring the ache in his arms, and slipped through the broken arches into the shadows beyond. The enemy voices grew louder, their search spreading through the ruins. Daniel kept to narrow alleys, his eyes sharp, his ears tuned to every sound. They moved slowly, the night stretching into a tense maze of hiding and running. Twice they almost walked into patrols, and twice Daniel pulled Lyra against the walls, waiting for the danger to pass. Her breathing was shallow against his chest, but she stayed silent, trusting his movements. Finally, they reached the edge of the city, where broken fields stretched under the night sky. Alien stars glittered above, pale blue and gold. Here, the air was cooler, though filled with the smell of smoke carried by the wind. Daniel set her down beside a half-destroyed transport cart. "We'll rest here for a moment," he said. Lyra looked at the stars, her eyes reflecting their faint light. "I used to dream of leaving the city," she said softly. "But not like this, not running for my life." Daniel sat beside her, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. "Dreams rarely come as we expect," he said, "but sometimes the path we don't choose leads us to where we're meant to be." She turned her head, studying him. "Do humans always speak like that?" Daniel gave a small laugh. "Not always. Most of the time, we complain." Her lips curved in another faint smile. It was fragile, but real. The sound of drones suddenly filled the air. Small machines with glowing eyes scanned the fields, searching for heat signatures. Daniel cursed under his breath and pulled Lyra under the transport cart. The drones passed overhead, their shadows stretching across the ground, then moved on. Lyra pressed closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "They won't stop. They'll keep chasing us. You should leave me. Save yourself." Daniel shook his head firmly. "Not a chance. They used you as bait, but now you're under my protection, and I don't abandon those under my protection." Her eyes searched his face as if testing his words. "At last," she whispered. "Then I'll trust you, Daniel." Something shifted between them in that moment. She was no longer just someone he had saved. She was a companion now, bound to him not by accident but by choice. The night grew colder, the fires of the city dimming behind them. Daniel watched the horizon, his mind heavy with questions. Who had planned the trap? Why did they need to lure a human? And what secret role did Lyra still hold in this? But he kept those questions to himself for now. Beside him, Lyra finally drifted into sleep, her head resting lightly against his arm. For the first time since the fire, her face looked peaceful. Daniel stayed awake, guarding her through the night. The stars above seemed distant, uncaring, but within him, a fire burned brighter than any falling tower. He had walked into their trap and lived. He had carried someone they thought worthless and given her another chance, and deep inside he knew this was only the beginning. The morning light on the alien world was dim, filtered through a thick haze of smoke still hanging over the city. Daniel stretched his arms, stiff from keeping watch all night. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but his grip on his weapon had never loosened. Beside him, Lyra stirred awake, blinking at the faint sunlight. For a moment the world seemed calm. Birds, strange and crystal-winged, flew overhead, their cries sharp against the silence, but the peace did not last long. In the distance, the sound of engines rumbled across the barren fields. Enemy patrols were already searching again. Daniel crouched beside Lyra. "We need to move. They'll find this place soon." She nodded, her face pale but determined. She no longer looked like a helpless prisoner. Her eyes carried the fire of someone who wanted to live. They slipped from the ruins of the cart and moved toward the shadow of the hills. The land outside the city was wild, covered with tall grass that shimmered faintly blue under the alien sun. Far beyond, forests of glowing trees stretched toward the horizon, their branches twisting like silver wires. Daniel kept his steps quiet, his hand steady on his weapon. Lyra followed close, her silks torn and soot-stained, yet she carried herself with a dignity that seemed out of place in the wasteland. "Do you know a safe place?" Daniel asked as they walked. She glanced toward the forests. "There are tunnels beneath the hills, old supply routes. Few know of them. We can hide there." Daniel nodded. "Then that's where we'll go." But reaching the hills was not simple. The sound of drones filled the air once more. Small machines swept the skies, their sensors scanning the fields. Daniel pulled Lyra down into the tall grass, motioning for silence. The drones passed above them, but one broke away, hovering lower. Its bright eyes scanned the ground, drawing closer. Daniel tensed, ready to fire, but Lyra placed a hand on his arm. She whispered, "Wait." She picked up a shard of crystal from the ground and threw it far across the field. The shard glittered in the sunlight as it landed. The drone turned sharply, chasing the movement, and drifted away. Daniel looked at her, surprised. Lyra gave a faint smile. "I was a servant in their palaces. I watched how they used these machines. Sometimes being unnoticed teaches you more than being in power." For the first time, Daniel saw her not as a victim but as someone with knowledge he lacked. She was more than she appeared, and that thought stayed with him as they moved on. By midday, they reached the edge of the glowing forest. The trees stretched high, their bark shining like polished stone, their leaves casting soft light in pale blue. The air inside was cooler, filled with strange whispers of wind moving through hollow branches. Daniel felt uneasy, but Lyra walked with familiarity. "I used to come here when I was younger," she said quietly. "It was the only place that felt free." They followed winding paths until they reached a hidden entrance in the roots of a giant tree. A dark tunnel led downward. "This will take us under the hills," Lyra explained. Daniel lit a small light from his pack and led the way. The tunnel was narrow, with walls carved long ago by forgotten builders. Their footsteps echoed softly. But safety was short-lived. Voices echoed behind them. The enemy had tracked them even here. Daniel and Lyra hurried deeper, the tunnel twisting. Into darkness. The sound of armored boots grew louder. Daniel stopped at a fork in the path. He glanced at Lyra. "Which way?" She closed her eyes, remembering. "Left. The right path collapses." Without hesitation, Daniel turned left. Moments later, the sound of falling stone filled the air as the right tunnel caved in. Lyra had saved them again. They pressed on until the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. Stalactites hung like teeth from the ceiling, and pools of water reflected their light. Here they paused, breathing heavily. Daniel sat against a rock, wiping sweat from his brow. "They don't stop, do they?" Lyra shook her head. "They won't stop until one of us is gone." Her voice was steady, but her eyes held sadness. Daniel watched her quietly. For someone used as bait, she carried herself with remarkable strength. "You've lived through worse than I thought," Daniel said softly. She looked at him. "I survived because no one noticed me. I was invisible, forgotten, but you..." Her voice lowered. "You noticed me, and that may be the reason I'm still alive." Daniel felt her words sink deep. He had acted on instinct when he ran into the fire, but now it felt like fate. Their moment was broken by the sudden hum of more drones. The sound grew louder, echoing through the tunnels. Lights flickered at the far end of the chamber. "They found us again," Daniel said. This time, running was not enough. Daniel gripped his weapon and stood. "We'll have to fight." Lyra's eyes widened. "There are too many." "Then we fight smart," Daniel replied. He motioned for her to follow and moved quickly toward the side of the chamber, where sharp rocks jutted out above a pool. He guided her into a narrow crevice and whispered, "Stay hidden. When they come closer, I'll lead them away." But Lyra shook her head firmly. "No. If I only hide, I remain what they made me. Useless bait. I will help." Daniel studied her, then gave a slow nod. "All right, but follow my lead." The drones entered the chamber, their lights cutting through the shadows. Behind them, enemy soldiers advanced with heavy steps. Daniel threw a stone into the far corner of the chamber. The sound echoed and the soldiers turned, firing blindly into the dark. While their attention shifted, Daniel fired a precise shot, striking a drone and sending it crashing into the water. Sparks lit the chamber as chaos spread. Lyra seized another crystal shard and hurled it into a weak support of the ceiling. With a loud crack, a section of rock collapsed, sealing one tunnel and scattering soldiers. The fight was quick and fierce. Daniel moved like a shadow, striking when the enemy was distracted. Lyra used her knowledge of the tunnels, pointing out weak spots, guiding him through the chaos. Together they survived what should have been impossible. When the last echoes faded, silence filled the chamber once more. Smoke and dust swirled around them. Daniel lowered his weapon, breathing hard. Lyra stood beside him, her chest rising and falling quickly, her face glowing faintly in the light of the crystals. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel gave a tired smile. "You're no bait, Lyra. You're the reason we made it out alive." Her eyes softened, and for the first time she allowed herself a real smile. The bond between them had changed. No longer rescuer and rescued, they were partners now, bound by survival and trust. But deep inside, Daniel knew the hunt was not over. The enemy would not forgive their failure. And as he looked at Lyra, he wondered if her role in this war was greater than even she realized. The forest tunnels whispered with the sound of unseen winds, carrying with them the promise of both danger and destiny. The chamber of stone was silent again, but Daniel knew it would not last. The enemy would regroup and return in greater numbers. He leaned against a rock, catching his breath, while Lyra studied the blocked tunnels they had collapsed during the fight. "They'll send more," Daniel said, his voice low. "We can't just keep running. They'll catch us eventually." Lyra looked at him, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Then we stop running. We turn their trap against them." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You mean bait them back?" A faint smile touched her lips. "They used me to lure you. Now we use me to lure them." Daniel frowned, shaking his head. "Too dangerous. They'll kill you without hesitation." Her voice was steady. "They already tried to throw me away. Hiding will not change that. But if we fight smart, we can strike them where they're weakest." Daniel studied her in silence. He saw no fear in her face, only determination. She was no longer the fragile girl he carried out of the fire. She was someone who wanted to choose her own fate. Finally, he gave a nod. "All right, then let's make them regret their plan." They moved deeper into the tunnels, searching for a place to set their ambush. The underground passages twisted like a maze, some leading to collapsed caverns, others opening into vast chambers filled with glowing crystals. Lyra guided them with steady steps, recalling paths from her years as a servant. At last they found a chamber wide enough to fight, but narrow enough that soldiers could not enter in large numbers. Stalactites hung overhead, and pools of water covered the floor. Natural stone pillars offered cover. "This is where we stand," Daniel said, running his hand over the rough rock. He placed his pack on the ground and began setting traps from the supplies he carried: mines, small charges, and tripwires. His human training gave him skill, but Lyra added something more. She showed him hidden cracks in the walls where explosives would collapse stone. She pointed out water channels that could be redirected to flood parts of the chamber. "I watched the engineers when they built these tunnels," she explained. "No one noticed me then, but I noticed everything." Daniel gave her a look of respect. Seems they underestimated the wrong person. By nightfall, their plan was ready. The chamber was laced with traps, the pillars marked for collapse, the pools of water turned into hidden dangers. Now they only had to wait. The enemy came as expected, heavily armed soldiers leading waves of drones. Their lights cut through the darkness, their voices sharp with orders. The sound of boots echoed as they entered the chamber. At the center stood Lyra, her figure framed by the faint glow of crystals. She looked fragile in her torn silks, but her eyes held steel. She had chosen to stand as bait once more, but this time it was by her own choice. Target located. One soldier barked. The army advanced, and then the chamber erupted. Daniel triggered. The first charge and a section of the ceiling collapsed, crushing 2 drones. Water burst from the channels, flooding the floor and slowing the soldiers' steps. Lyra moved quickly, throwing shards of crystal to distract drones, guiding them exactly where Daniel wanted them. Explosions echoed through the tunnels as Daniel fired from the shadows, his shots precise, each strike dropping a target. The soldiers tried to regroup, but the narrow chamber turned their numbers into chaos. When one squad pushed too far, Daniel triggered another trap, collapsing a stone pillar and sealing their path. Dust filled the air, and confusion spread through their ranks. They thought they were the hunters, Lyra whispered, crouched behind a rock beside Daniel. But now they are the prey. Daniel grinned despite the danger. I like the sound of that. The fight raged on. Soldiers slipped in the water, drones smashed into falling rocks, and every trap tightened the noose. Lyra's knowledge of the tunnels guided Daniel at every step. She pointed out weak ceilings, narrow choke points, hidden ledges. Each detail turned the enemy's advantage into weakness, but victory was not without cost. Daniel was struck by flying debris when another pillar fell. Pain shot through his side and blood stained his uniform. He staggered but kept fighting, refusing to let weakness show. Lyra rushed to his side, her face pale with fear. You're hurt. I've been worse, Daniel muttered, pressing his hand against the wound. He steadied himself against a rock, his weapon still ready. This isn't over yet. She refused to leave him, even when the enemy pressed harder. She threw another shard, striking a drone's sensor, blinding it. Her courage burned brighter than the crystals around them. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last explosion shook the chamber. Dust rained down and silence fell once more. The enemy had been crushed, their forces scattered. Daniel sank to his knees, exhaustion weighing heavy on him. His wound burned, his vision blurred, but he managed a tired smile. Looks like we won. Lyra knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed cloth against his wound. You saved me once. I will not let you fall now. Her voice was fierce, filled with promise. Daniel looked at her, meeting her gaze through the haze of pain. You're stronger than you know, Lyra. Her eyes glistened, but her expression was steady. No, I'm only strong because you gave me the chance. They stayed like that, side by side in the wreckage of the chamber, the echoes of battle fading into silence. Hours later, when the dust settled, Daniel forced himself to his feet with Lyra's help. His steps were slow, but he refused to stop. What, now? She asked quietly as they left the chamber. Daniel's eyes hardened. Now we find the ones who planned this. Whoever set this trap didn't just want me dead. They wanted to prove humans are weak. We'll show them the truth. Lyra nodded, her grip tightening on his arm to steady him. Then we do it together. Together they left the tunnels behind. The night sky opened above them once more, stars shining through the smoke. The bond between them had grown stronger in fire and blood. The enemy had failed to break them. Instead, they had forged something new, a partnership born not of duty but of choice. And as Daniel looked at the stars, he knew their fight was far from over. The night air outside the tunnels was sharp and cool, a welcome change from the smoke-filled caverns they had left behind. Daniel leaned heavily on a broken staff he had found along the way, his side still bleeding but wrapped tightly by Lyra's careful hands. Each step was painful, yet he refused to slow down. Lyra walked close, her eyes scanning the horizon. Beyond the hills, the alien city still burned. Columns of smoke rose into the sky, hiding some of the stars. The war was far from over, but here, in the wilderness, it felt like a different world, quiet, uncertain yet strangely full of promise. For hours they moved across the fields. At times Daniel nearly collapsed, but Lyra supported him, refusing to let him fall. He had saved her from the flames. Now she saved him from the shadows of pain. Finally, they reached a ridge where they could rest. The ridge overlooked the plains, and from there they saw movement in the distance. Enemy forces regrouping, gathering in numbers. The trap had failed, but the enemy was not finished. Daniel sat on a rock, catching his breath. "They'll come again," he said. Lyra knelt beside him, her hands folded tightly. "Then we must strike first, we can't run forever." He gave a tired smile. "You sound like a soldier." She shook her head softly. "No, I sound like someone who is tired of being powerless." Daniel studied her for a moment. She had changed since he first carried her out of the flames. She no longer looked like a servant girl dressed in silks. She looked like someone who carried strength within, hidden for too long. "We can't take an army by ourselves," Daniel said. "But if your people know what happened, if they know the enemy used you as bait, maybe they'll rise." Lyra's eyes darkened. "My people will not listen to me. I am nothing to them. A servant, a face they can forget." Daniel reached out and touched her shoulder gently. "Not anymore. They'll see you differently now. You stood against soldiers, you fought with me, you survived when no one else could. That makes you more than bait. That makes you a symbol." Her gaze softened and she lowered her head as if unsure whether to believe him. But in her heart, something stirred. The next day, they set out toward a nearby settlement. It was small, hidden in the valley and home to survivors of the war. When they entered, the people stared in shock. A human soldier, wounded but standing, and beside him a girl dressed in torn silks, her hair tangled, yet her eyes burning with determination. Whispers spread quickly. "That's the girl from the palace fire. She lived. And a human walks with her." The settlement's leader, an elder with silver skin and tired eyes, stepped forward. "What happened in the city?" he asked. Lyra lifted her chin, her voice clear. "They used me as bait. They wanted to break the human, to prove he was weak. But he survived. And together we fought back." The elder's eyes widened, and the whispers grew louder. Lyra's words carried weight, more than she had ever expected. The people began to look at her not as a servant, but as someone who had stood against the impossible. Daniel stood beside her, silent, letting her speak. He knew this moment was hers. "The enemy thinks compassion is weakness," Lyra continued. "But they are wrong. It was compassion that saved me from the flames. It was compassion that gave me strength to fight. And if we join together, human and alien, we can turn this war." The crowd stirred, their fear slowly changing into hope. The elder nodded slowly. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this is the moment we must stand." Daniel stepped forward then, his voice firm despite the pain in his side. "We cannot win by numbers alone, but we can win by spirit, by refusing to be broken." They wanted to use Lyra as bait to prove humanity weak. Instead, she proved that neither of us can be broken. The people murmured in agreement, some lifting their hands in quiet salute. Days passed and word spread across the settlements. Stories grew of the girl who had been bait and the human who saved her. They became a symbol, an unlikely pair who had turned a trap into victory. Soldiers who once doubted humans began to see Daniel with new respect. Civilians who once overlooked Lyra began to see her as a voice worth hearing. But the enemy did not stay silent. Scouts reported that the same commanders who had planned the trap were gathering forces for another strike. Daniel prepared as best he could, though his wound slowed him. He spent his days training survivors, teaching them simple tactics. Lyra worked beside him, guiding her people with quiet strength. She no longer hid in the shadows. She spoke with clarity, and others listened. One evening, as the two sat by the edge of the camp watching the stars, Lyra turned to him. "Do you ever regret saving me?" Daniel looked at her, surprised. "Why would I regret it?" "Because I was not royalty," she said softly. "I was no one. Saving me did not change the war. Not at first." Daniel shook his head. "You're wrong. Saving you changed everything. If I had saved a princess, maybe it would have been just duty. But saving you, someone they thought worthless, showed me the truth. No life is worthless. That's what makes humans strong. Not weapons, not numbers, but the belief that everyone matters. Lyra's eyes glistened and she turned away, staring at the stars. His words struck her heart more deeply than he knew. The final battle came sooner than expected. Enemy soldiers marched toward the valley, their armor gleaming under the pale light. Drones filled the sky, their hum echoing like thunder. But this time Daniel and Lyra were ready. The people stood with them, no longer fearful but filled with resolve. They had seen courage with their own eyes, and they were no longer willing to bow. The fight was fierce. The enemy pressed hard, but every strike was met with resistance. Daniel fought with steady aim despite his wound. Lyra guided the fighters, shouting warnings, pointing out weak spots, moving through the battle with fearless steps. At one point, an enemy soldier broke through the line and rushed toward Daniel. His weapon lifted, ready to strike. But before Daniel could react, Lyra stepped forward, seizing a fallen spear and driving it into the ground before the soldier. Her courage turned the tide, the fighters rallying at her side. When the dust finally settled, the enemy forces pulled back. They had failed again. The valley remained free. That night, the survivors gathered in the settlement square. Fires burned brightly, not with destruction but with celebration. Songs rose, voices filled with hope. The elder spoke to the crowd. Tonight we honor two who showed us the truth, a human who would not abandon us, and a girl who was once a servant, now a symbol of our strength. Together they have reminded us that compassion is not weakness, it is our greatest weapon. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing into the night. Lyra stood beside Daniel, her eyes wide at the sight. She had never imagined this, her people, looking at her with respect, her voice carrying weight. She turned to Daniel, her voice soft. You gave me this chance. Daniel shook his head. No. You took it. You chose to fight, to stand, to lead. All I did was believe in you. For a moment they stood in silence, the firelight dancing across their faces. The bond between them was unspoken, but undeniable. The war was not over. Many battles still lay ahead, but something greater had begun. Trust between human and alien, hope rising where there had been only despair. Daniel looked up at the stars, his hand resting lightly on his side. He knew his journey was far from finished, but with Lyra beside him, he no longer felt alone. What had begun as a trap had turned into a story of survival, courage, and unexpected destiny. And as the night carried their voices into the sky, one truth burned brighter than all else. Humans were not weak. They were the fire that could not be extinguished.